Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Making Monsters. I'm Taylor Dahl, and we are joined by Tyler Forness. He covers the Vikings and the NFL draft, which I've talked to you about both, Tyler, in our time that we have shared together on several podcasts. You work for A to Z Sports, Skor, North, a lot of different formats that you kind of do through both of those. But I appreciate you for hopping on again. I know each time it's kind of been about something a little bit different, whether it's a game preview, the draft. Now it's about a coaching search.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the best parts about whenever we talk. It's always about something new, something fresh, and I'm really intrigued to see the direction that the Bears go here.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unfortunate, another coaching search. I don't think you don't want to have to go through these, the amount that obviously the Bears have had to. And since they fired Lovie Smith after a 10-6 season, it's been hiring after hiring after hiring. And so now their fan base are kind of just to the point now where, like, can we just get a coach that you feel like can develop a quarterback properly, or at least hire somebody to develop a quarterback properly and be here for a little while. So we will see which direction, because they have a long list of names, 17, 18, 19 names they've requested to follow so far in this coaching search, or requested to interview in this coaching search. And I want to talk to you about some of those other names a little bit later. But the reason, obviously, being covering the Vikings, Brian Flores, he's a name that people are familiar with. So I do want to start with that, because the Bears are interviewing Brian Flores tomorrow, Saturday, January 18th. They do have their scheduled interview with Flores. And so he has been the defensive coordinator for you guys for 2 seasons now. Before that, he did some stuff with, I'm trying to remember, where was he? Was somewhere for a little bit. Oh, Steelers in between that time frame a little bit. And then obviously before that was the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. That didn't end well. The Miami Dolphins time was a lot of storylines, and the storylines weren't positive. It was, kind of some stuff between him and Tua. Did he mess up the start of Tua's career? And then obviously there was lawsuits when it came to racial discrimination. So there wasn't the best storyline surrounding Brian Flores when he left Miami, or when he got fired from Miami. So tell us a little bit about what you know of that situation and what has happened since then in his journey to Minnesota.
I think some of that stems with just the fact that he was a Bill Belichick guy, and every Bill Belichick guy that leaves Bill Belichick brings some of Bill Belichick with him, but it's a Bill Belichick cosplay. And Belichick is stern. He's tough. He kind of runs with a military authoritarian approach, but he has more credibility than probably any coach in National Football League history. So you buy into it a lot more than if Josh McDaniels does it, or Brian Flores does it, or Charlie Weiss. Bill O'Brien is kind of his own thing. He is kind of a Belichick guy, but he's also not a Belichick guy. He's kind of weaved in and out of those circles, even spending time with Nick Saban, who is a Bill Belichick guy. So looking at kind of all of those things, Flores got the most out of the players there. And he was not trying to tank when ownership was trying to tank. And that created some tension there. He honestly was really good in Miami, and we were kind of surprised that they ended up taking that change. And then you start hearing things, come out of Miami, where he didn't have that great relationship with Tua. He was too much of a dictator, authoritarian, and kind of a jerk. And Ryan Fitzpatrick even came out on, I think might have been his podcast a couple days ago, saying like Flores, this, that, and the other thing. He was not connecting with his players. He was too much of a dictator. And I think those things might have been true. And I think that Flores as a whole took too much of that Belichick approach and not enough of who he is, because then it was almost like the Steelers were Brian Flores' rehab. And he goes to Pittsburgh, and Mike Tomlin honestly deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for everything that he's had to deal with in that locker room. Lately with George Pickens, you had Deontay Johnson, you had Antonio Brown, all the Ben Roethlisberger stuff, those legal issues back in the day, just how he's had to navigate that locker room and culture. And he's been able to do it consistently for 17 years is just being beyond impressive. So he kind of just got back to his roots of connecting with people and coaching, and not having that level of stress and not being that level of dictator. And that has translated tenfold into what we're seeing in Minnesota. If you were to look at what he did in Miami versus what he's doing here, it's almost two different people. The players love him. When Tua made those comments, like Harrison Phillips and Josh Metellus were standing at the podium almost like Secret Service agents, like, we got your back. And that was a really big statement. And Flores was honest about it. He's like, look, I probably could have done a better job in my time there. And he was just honest, candid, and he was vulnerable in that spot. And I think that showed real growth. And everything that you hear from inside the building, everything you hear from players is incredibly positive. So I'm not going to say you should ignore the Miami stuff, but just like with anything, you want to look at the recent trends, the recent examples, and people can grow. Just look at Sam Darnold's career. Just borderline garbage through the first 5-6 years of his career. And then he was in MVP conversations for a few weeks this year. That's not to say the first few years don't matter at all, but the most recent example, like, well, what have you done for me lately? I think that matters a little bit more, and everything should be contextualized as such.
Yeah, a couple things off of that. It's funny because I just saw a tweet a few days ago that someone said, if I was a wide receiver drafted by the Steelers, I might question, am I an a-hole?
Yes.
What is this? And you start going through, and obviously the Antonio Brown stuff, even Chase Claypool, then you have George Pickens, and there's all these names that you kind of go through that, Mike Tomlin dealt with a lot there. And to your point of the rehab and in Pittsburgh, I think that is it's a really good point, because we did see a lot of these things kind of not go the way that you really wanted to off the football field in Miami. To your point, I think there was a lot of positives you could take out of his coaching ability when it came to what he was coaching out of players and what he was getting out of a rookie Tua with not anywhere near the weapons that they have in Miami right now. And I think that when you go maybe to a team like that, and you're around Bill Belichick so much that, you're kind of brainwashed into the system of this is how you have to coach these guys. And then you go to a Pittsburgh and you see that Mike Tomlin does have this tough, hard-nosed type of personality, but he's not an a-hole. And so you're like, okay, you can have both the best of both worlds. And I feel like maybe that's what Brian Flores took with him to Minnesota.
I think so too. And it's not that Belichick doesn't love his guys. He grew up in a Navy household. He talked about when he took the head coaching job in North Carolina, that's where he grew up. And then his dad went to Navy. And that is a completely different style of being a head coach, because not only are you a head coach, you have to deal with naval regulations and that kind of schedule and that type of structure and learning environment. So Belichick had a unique upbringing in that sense, and that is translated to a lot of his assistants, and that has been a negative, especially in today's world. Today's world is not like the 1960s and 70s where authoritarian approaches work consistently. There has to be a level of compassion and understanding, and I think having that experience with Tomlin, because Tomlin was in Minnesota for a year, and nobody thought he was ready to be a head coach. And the Steelers hired him anyway because they knew, hey, we want to get this right, and long term, this is the right guy. And well, nobody can say they were wrong. And I think having that year to just decompress and not have to worry about coaching an entire unit, just coaching a position group and being able to relax and refresh. And I think that's translated so well into the success that we've seen with the Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah, and I think if we're looking at success stories in that type of coaching, it's like a Dan Campbell. A Dan Campbell is also one of those guys that will bite your kneecaps off, but he'll also cry at the podium if he feels like he let down his players. And so I do think we are in this generation of players who like to see that side of coaches too. And that's why we kind of saw the fizzle out of Tom Coughlin when he got back to Jacksonville, because they weren't, you can't coach that style anymore most times. And it's still, people take it the same way that they used to take it. And so you do have to have a balance. Let's go back to when Minnesota did decide that they were bringing in Brian Flores to be the defensive coordinator. What was the original reaction, that first initial reaction of Vikings fans and media when they did announce that hire?
Oh, home run. Everybody was thrilled. And one of the reasons why they were so thrilled is because they knew that there was going to be cohesiveness with Kevin O'Connell, Brian Flores, because Flores was an assistant when Kevin O'Connell was drafted. And Flores might have been a scout at that point, because I think he was just out of school at Boston College, where he and Ryan Poles were, I believe, fraternity brothers.
I love that.
That's going to be a really interesting angle here. And it was just a home run, because we had seen the Vic Fangio defense come in here. When Vic Fangio was in Chicago, Vic Fangio was running the defense. We had his assistant, Ed Donatel, running it. And Donatel was just a Vic Fangio cosplayer. He didn't know how to run the defense. He wasn't Vic Fangio. And that manifested itself in the worst way and honestly cost the Vikings a lot of games. And now you have Brian Flores coming in here, and he is awesome right away and then fizzles out at the end of the year. Why? Talent gap. So what do
Yeah.
they do? They bring in more players suited to Brian Flores, and they were increasingly better. They were 5th in scoring defense, 2nd in rush defense over the course of the 2024 season. It didn't end great, but there was still a major talent gap because the Vikings had $72 million in dead cap. But the one thing I think Bears fans can be excited about is everything that Brian Flores does is tailored directly to what his personnel is. They were running a lot of Bengal Hawk blitzes in 2023 where you would have, like, you would send an overload if whatever way the center faces, those two guys drop. So sometimes you'd have nose tackles dropping into like shallow hook zones. That's not exactly a way you want to live consistently, but it was what they had to do to make it work. This year, a lot of stunts, consistent 5-man pressures, just get penetration and get pressure wherever you can. And it worked. Andrew Van Ginkel's a 2nd-team All-Pro. He and Jonathan Grenard are the starting edge rushers for the NFC. Like, this has been a really good defense, and he's tailored it to what he has. So whatever he has to work with in Chicago in this theoretical example, he's going to make it work. He's going to utilize his concepts to the best of his ability with his personnel. And I think that is a really, really exciting element about what Brian Flores is as a coach. And culturally, it's not going to be what you saw in Miami. It's going to be a lot more of a Kevin O'Connell, Mike Tomlin influence where there's going to be a lot of love and compassion.
Yeah.
Tough love, sure.
Yeah.
And he's going to let you know if you screw up, but that's what a good coach is supposed to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I think we've seen that in the last few years of Chicago's defense. We're still seeing it kind of fell off after Eberflus was fired this year. And that was kind of my point for the majority of the year was I know a lot of people were frustrated with his time management and the timeouts and all of that stuff. But Eberflus is a really good defensive coordinator. And there was a reason that he did have a lot of these guys. He had the hits principle was his thing. And so from that, it really did work. And he kind of built this defense to fit that. And so it is nice to hear that someone like Brian Flores could come in and kind of take what the Bears have. Obviously, there's some upgrades needed. I would say the Bears still need another pass rusher because to your point, the Vikings having both the edge rushers that are starting and both the NFC edge rushers for the Pro Bowl. That's kind of nice. But also they got criticized heavily when they let Danielle Hunter go and got Jonathan Grenard. And then you have guys like Pat Jones, who's the third guy on their defense with I think it's like the 3rd most sacks on that defense. And that's a guy that's kind of more of a rotational piece. And so I do think it's beneficial when you see somebody who can take the pieces that they do have and make the most out of it. Mm-hmm. Do you think in any part, though, that Brian Flores was looking at this and did see something in a Jonathan Grenard that he would like to work with in comparison to a Danielle Hunter?
I think the biggest thing between Jonathan Grenard and Danielle Hunter is fit. Yeah. Hunter was not a fit for how Brian Flores wanted to play. Brian Flores likes to do a lot of quick penetrations. Danielle Hunter is a traditional wide 9 defensive end in a 4-3 even front, and he wants to get at it methodically, and he's great at doing that. He was phenomenal with the Houston Texans this year, but he did not fit how Brian Flores wanted to play. Flores adapted to Hunter. They used him some stand-up, but they let him put his hand in the dirt, and it worked. But long-term, they needed to move on.
Yeah.
And Hunter's not even 30 years old. He just spent his 11th year in the league. Just absolutely insane. Sorry, yeah. It was his 10th year in the league this year. So you get Grenard, who's not quite as good as Hunter, but it's a better fit. He's incredibly quick off the ball. He's got those long arms. How he wants to win is different than Hunter. And I think that element is such a big factor in why there was so much success, especially early on this year. Fit matters more than talent when talent is somewhat equal. Yeah. I would rather have a square to put in the square hole than a cylinder to put in that square hole. Yeah. Because it's just a seamless fit. You can get the cylinder in there, but it's not going to be a perfect fit. You're going to have to fill in some gaps, and that's fine if that's what you have to do. But if you have a choice, the Vikings ended up saving almost $5 million by getting a better fit player in Grenard. And then you can direct that to getting a cornerback to help fortify the room. And they did so in Shaq Griffin, and he was a very capable player this year. So having fit matters, but he can make whatever work if he needs to.
The one thing that stood out, especially these last 2 years with the Vikings, and we talked about this on my last podcast, is the amount of times that the Vikings blitz. Is that they're very blitz heavy last year, still blitzed a ton this year, but it did seem a little bit more strategical this year compared to last year. It was just like go after guys and get to them. Is that a Brian Flores thing?
Yes and no. So I think the one thing that needs to be understood a little bit, what the NFL stats quantify as a blitz is 5 or more rushers.
Okay.
Brian Flores' base package with this year was rush 5 guys. So what everybody else sees as the Vikings blitzing isn't necessarily the Vikings blitzing.
It's their base defense.
It's just their base defense.
Yeah.
And that how you quantify that piece, it is significantly different, but it worked. They had 48 sacks this year. They were consistently driving pressure, and they were making guys make very quick decisions. The problem was the only 2 teams that beat them had quarterbacks that are great at making really quick decisions against the blitz in Matthew Stafford and Jared Goff. Mm-hmm. And they still were able to give those guys problems. Goff threw 2 picks against the Vikings in week 18. That game was way closer than the 31-9 score. 17-9 going into the fourth quarter, and then the Vikings absolutely collapsed. But it was a decent game for a long time. Why? The defense held up. And I do think ideally Brian Flores does not want to blitz all the time. He wants to play man coverage. He did not have the guys to play man coverage a majority of the snaps. He did against teams that did not have great wide receivers. But against teams that had really good wide receivers, he didn't play a lot of man coverage because he didn't trust Stephon Gilmore and Shaq Griffin to run across the field. He trusted Byron Murphy, but you have to be able to trust more than one guy when you're playing man coverage. So when you're blitzing, you're playing zone, well, there are blatant holes. You can only cover so much ground with 6 guys on the back end. And guys like Stafford and Goff will pick you apart. They'll be like, I will take 7 yards. I will take 6 yards. Guess what? We just moved 13 yards in 2 plays. Now we're getting closer to field goal range. And they nickel and dime you to death. Yeah. Flores would prefer you nickel and dime him to death than getting explosives, which the Vikings did a great job of controlling this year. But man, is it debilitating when you're on the field for 11 plays and they just nickel and dime you all the way for a touchdown, because the elite guys, elite coordinators can do that to you. So I think one more year, if Flores ends up staying, you get a couple of cornerbacks in here that can play man coverage. You get a penetrator on the defensive line that can win one-on-one on third down. I think could transform this defense into a really elite unit.
Yeah, it's interesting because I put a tweet, this is probably a month ago now, maybe 3 weeks ago, of my yeses. I wouldn't mind these as a coach, my maybes and my nos. And I put Brian Flores in my maybe. And a lot of people were like going crazy in my mentions, like, no way, Brian Flores, blah, blah, blah. And it's weird because I think he has this almost like fake hate surrounding him because it goes back to just what the bits they know about Miami and it not really what he could possibly do on the football field. But do you think, just from your perspective, and you use that word growth, I've heard it before, of his growth as being that leader, the leadership role, but do you think that he would be able to make the jump right now to a head coach, or do you think it'd benefit him to maybe be that coordinator for a little longer?
I think both would be fine. I think Flores has learned enough in his 3 years since being a head coach where if you were to go to the regular organization that understands who he is and how he's going to adapt and the right players, I think he'd be just fine as a head coach. Selfishly, you can't have him. I want to keep him. He's been such a great asset to this team, and he's done wonders with this unit that has really just been kind of treading water ever since the end of the Mike Zimmer era. Because once Zimmer lost his guys, other than third down effectiveness, they stunk. That defense was bad. And Flores has really done a lot with a little. And I want to be able to keep seeing that. But if he leaves, it's going to be because he deserves it. And I would wish him absolute well.
Yeah, and that's what it's interesting because obviously we're talking to the Vikings about Brian Flores, both Aaron Glenn and Ben Johnson from the Lions. So there's a lot of in-division stuff, which it's funny because people's argument for like a Ben Johnson, for example, they're like, why would he want to coach and go to a division that is one of the best divisions in the league? I'm like, he's 15-3 in the NFC North. Talking about Ben Johnson, like, I don't think he's afraid to face any of the NFC North teams. But, and I also think these guys are competitors, and I don't think anybody would steer away from a division because the division's good. But I do think that in a circumstance like Brian Flores, it would need to be the right fit. That you'd obviously want to have the confidence in him that he would be able to hire the right coordinators, because then now you have a defensive minded coach. So you need to find somebody who is ready to develop Caleb Williams, because he's already had 3 offensive coordinators this year. So you don't want to have to go through another pile of those. But, and I mentioned a second ago, Tyler, the Bears definitely need another pass rusher. This last year, opposite Montez Sweat, it was just kind of a revolving door of DeMarcus Walker, Darrell Taylor, maybe a little Austin Booker in there. But what do you see Montez Sweat fitting in a system that Brian Flores can run?
I think he can. He was thriving in the 3-4 that the Commanders are running until he ended up getting traded to Chicago. I think his best fit is probably in that Eberflus style defense where you could have him as a wide 9 in an even front. But I do think he can thrive as a stand-up because we've already seen it. So I wouldn't worry so much about trying to cater the defense to what Montez Sweat does, because he is versatile in that way. But that extra pass rusher would be really huge for the Bears to be able to have somebody establish themselves. They don't need to be elite. 8 sacks a year. You don't need a ton opposite of Montez Sweat. Just get somebody decent. And I remember you talking to me about DeMarcus Walker before the first meeting between the teams, and he showed out. And I remember talking to some of my Vikings friends. I'm like, Taylor mentioned that he was going to be really good, and boom, there he was. So maybe he can take another step forward. But Austin Booker, I really like coming out of Kansas, but he would be a better fit with what Brian Flores wants to do than what Eberflus was wanting to do, because he's a small boy. He's skinny. He is not powerful, but he's good bending around the arc. He's good getting to the quarterback, and he's going to be able to be given a lot more of those type of opportunities with Flores, and even as like a blitzer and a stunter. Like, just use him as a looper. So I think you can do a lot of those things with a guy like Booker, and Flores would be able to maximize that. But whoever that pass rusher ends up being, that's going to be huge in being able to really take that next step as like an overall unit.
Do you think Abdul Carter makes it to pick 10?
No. I'm going to be honest. Right now, I would, if the Browns don't go quarterback, I would be surprised if Abdul Carter makes it past 2. Especially with the Myles Garrett stuff, how he's like, look, I love this franchise. I want to be here, but you guys got to have a plan. You need to show me that you have a plan. And you know what? Giving him a running mate like Abdul Carter is a great idea. Plus, if Garrett wants out, you've got Abdul Carter. So and you can just do a 1-to-1 replacement. So that's where I think they'll end up going. And we're 3.5 months out. None of us really know anything. But I don't think, unless there's a gas mask bong or he tests athletically poor or has an injury concern, none of which I see happening. I think there's no chance that they get Abdul Carter without a trade up.
He's fantastic. Like, watching him in that Notre Dame game with like one arm practically. And also, was this his first year at the edge position?
If you looked at Micah Parsons' career body of work at Penn State, that's just Abdul Carter. They were both inside linebackers. They moved to edge their final year, and they showed a lot of growth. And he's just bonkers.
I do want to ask you a couple more before I let you go about some of these other coaches, because you are familiar with a lot of them. And this is the first episode of a series I'm doing of not everyone, because like I said, there's like 20 coaches that we've interviewed, and some I just think we're to check some boxes. But we have obviously a Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. Those are 2 names. Ben Johnson, the most popular name right now around the NFL, especially between Jags, Raiders, and the Bears. But thoughts on Ben Johnson, Aaron Glenn? What do you think they both go? How do you think they do at the next level? Thoughts on them?
I think Aaron Glenn's going to the Saints. And I think that's an unofficially official done deal, at least in my head canon. Just makes too much sense. Ben Johnson, he's weird. And I don't mean that in a bad way. He's just incredibly selective, and he doesn't necessarily care about getting a job. He wants the job. He wants to take a job and stay. So he's being incredibly selective. As far as what Ben Johnson does, if he's gonna want to run the exact same offense that he ran in Detroit, you don't want Ben Johnson. Caleb Williams is not the kind of quarterback to run that type of offense. He is not a guy that thrives in structure. He is not a guy that is going to do a lot of timing stuff. I'm a wild man. I run air raid stuff. I'm going to make the flashy play. And he doesn't want to be super structured like that. He wants to be kind of loosey-goosey. And with air raid and run and shoot type concepts, it's structured, but it's all abstract. Every route can have like 5 different endpoints based on the defense and their leverage. So that's the kind of stuff he likes. And one guy, I don't even know if he's on the list, but one guy that should absolutely be at the top of it is Liam Cohen from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the offensive coordinator, and especially because he worked with Baker Mayfield. And Baker Mayfield is not too dissimilar from Caleb Williams as far as a theory. They both played for Lincoln Riley. They both played in that air raid. They had their best success, shotgun, static kind of offenses. And the way he was able to blend that type of system with the McVay stuff that that's his bread and butter, I thought was so brilliant. And that's the kind of guy I would want working with Caleb Williams, because you're going to maximize the strengths while trying to implement some of the schemey stuff that works.
Yeah.
And for Bears fans, that's what I want for you. I want somebody who's going to maximize Caleb Williams. Mike McCarthy scares me for how the Aaron Rodgers stuff ended. Because Aaron Rodgers, like late Aaron Rodgers, is very similar to modern Caleb Williams. They just want to play backyard football.
Yeah.
And is he going to want to be too structured with him? And I think that could be a huge negative too. You have to have somebody who's willing to be abstract and build the structure in. And that's where I think Liam Cohen might be the best fit. Also, wild card, Pete Carroll. That's just a leader of men.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I don't trust Ryan Poles. I don't think Ryan Poles is a good GM. Thank God he didn't end up in Minnesota. I have a lot of respect for Kevin Warren. He did a phenomenal job leading the business, and he was also delved into like football ops in helping the entire organization. And then he led the Big Ten. The dude knows what he's doing. So if he's involved in the decision-making process, I would feel very comfortable about whatever decision Warren helps making, because the guy just understands business. He understands culture and leadership. And I think that is going to be a huge element to any success. I hope Poles proves me wrong. I just think he's not very good.
It's like kind of Twitter's turned on him. The Bears world has turned on him probably the last couple months. I personally like Ryan Poles. I think that what he took over and what he's done, there's definitely been some misses, but I think we see misses from every GM, especially when you don't have there's too many hands in the cookie jar to me, because you have Kevin Warren, because you have George McCaskey, because you have Ian Cunningham, and then you have Ryan Poles, and then you've had multiple coaches. There's too many voices trying to pull one direction. And I think George McCaskey doesn't know who he should listen to in certain circumstances when it comes to Ryan Poles or when it comes to Warren. Yeah. We've heard rumors that the reason they didn't get Jim Harbaugh is because Harbaugh hates Kevin Warren and that they couldn't even interview him because of that. So that's Big Ten stuff, obviously.
Oh,
but
that's interesting.
Yeah. So there's a lot of because even this year, there was like a rumor that maybe Ryan Day would want to come interview with the Bears. And I was like, he hates Kevin Warren too. Like, he's not going to come interview there. Not that I want Ryan Day either, but I also, a few of those things. Yes. You mentioned one of the names that I really love. And this goes back to the end of November. I tweeted, I said, there's 3 names that I want to be looking at in this last month. And it's Ben Johnson, Liam Cohen. And my third, I want to get your opinion on this one, because I also feel like it could fit a Caleb because of where he's been in recent years, and that's Todd Monken.
Monken's interesting. I wonder if they'd be willing to hire somebody that old for their first head coaching job. And I know
Pete Carroll.
I know I mentioned Pete Carroll, but Pete Carroll has a humongous track record of success. Yeah. He was a Bud Grant assistant at one point.
Like NFL quarterbacks back to college quarterbacks. Yeah.
Yeah. Like Pete Carroll was a Bud Grant assistant. That's how long he's been coaching. But he might be 73. He doesn't come off as 73. He comes off as in his mid 50s. And I think because he has the track record and you just kind of understand, hey, this might be a temporary kind of hire where we need to stabilize things. And let's be honest, the Bears need to stabilize that organization because of how up and down it's been over the past 10 years or so. So if you get Carroll to come in, stabilize things, and really just build up the infrastructure, and he can hand the keys over to somebody, I think that might be your best bet. But Monken is a great call because, I mean, he's 58. Yeah. He's been a great offensive coordinator. He's done an incredible job of melding what he wants to do with versus what he needs to do with his personnel. And I
Yeah.
think how he's elevated Lamar Jackson as a passer is one of the more underrated jobs in the National Football League. Lamar Jackson's never been a bad passer. Now he's a great passer.
Yeah.
And that jump, and especially a perception jump, because Lamar Jackson's always had this negative perception for, the obvious reasons.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't really exist anymore outside of the bozos who just don't want to prove themselves wrong.
Yeah.
So if they're willing to give a guy that's 58 years old his first head coaching job, because that's why Mike Zimmer almost didn't get hired.
Yeah.
Like, he almost didn't take the interview with the Vikings. He's like, I'm just never going to get it. Well, then he did.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if the Bears are willing to do it, I like it. I like that a lot.
Yeah, those have been my three that I've kind of stuck with. And I also think the things I've heard about Monken is he is also that he'll yell, he'll scream, he'll cuss at you. And it's honestly even a joke where it's like the McCaskies don't like cussing. Like, they wouldn't let anybody cuss on Hard Knocks. So it's like, are they going to hire someone who's like vocally cussing on videos? Hopefully they just push all that aside for this coaching hiring and like hire somebody they believe can lead people. And yes, we keep talking about that leader of men, and that's what you want. And I think the most important thing they have to look at right now is Caleb Williams. And to your point, going back to the Ben Johnson, that's why to me, like, Twitter's losing their mind over Ben Johnson. And I love Ben Johnson. I love he's quirky and crazy. And he ran a play against us where they fake tripped based off of a Packers play. And he does things like that. And it's so phenomenal to watch. But to your point, if it doesn't fit, if he's going to try to completely change what Caleb is, I don't know if it's going to work here. And because I think Caleb is who he is. And yes, maybe you can coach a little bit of structure into him. But you saw this last year when you let Caleb just go late in the third and fourth quarters, when you just let him do Caleb, that's when you got the best out of him. And so if he comes in and it's like, hey, I want to do what Detroit's doing, I want to run a Jared Goff, 2 running back, this two tight end type of offense, it's just not going to work. It's not going to work with Caleb.
And I'd want to be in the interview room with Ben Johnson and ask him a lot of these questions, because how much of it is he wants to run that versus he knows he has it and this is what we're going to do? That's the big question, and something I can't answer without having a conversation with him, because we have a limited sample size of what Johnson's been able to do, because he's had Jared Goff. And you have to maximize Jared Goff in the way to maximize Jared Goff. So if he's doing that because it's Goff, and then he would completely change a lot of the core concepts because it's Caleb Williams, then I think we're having a different conversation. And then I think Ben Johnson shoots right back up to the top. But based on what we do know, because that's all we can do, we have to judge based on what we know currently. I would want to stay away from Ben Johnson, because I think he's going to want to run the Goff stuff based on the only evidence we have, which is the Lions offense. And whatever, I just hope they get the right hire, because Bears fans have been tortured in a different way than Vikings fans. We're the most tortured. But my goodness, in my lifetime, the Bears have been good for like a total of 7 years.
Yeah.
And that stinks.
Yeah. Yeah, it sucks. And we have all of these numbers of like, oh, the last playoff win and the last time, you were in the playoffs and the last this. And it's like, you go back and they show these clips of Jay Cutler and you're like, we couldn't even take advantage of having a guy with that type of arm, and a coach in Lovie Smith, who, like I said, got fired after 10-6 season. And so every time the Bears have gotten a little glimpse of positive, everything gets ripped away within 1 or 2 seasons after that. And that's why another reason, like going back to Monken real quick, another reason because obviously he was at Georgia before that. And so going back to what he was able to do with 2 national championships at Georgia and then coming to the Ravens, and like what you said, Lamar was already good, but making Lamar the best version of himself, and also making him probably, you can't even argue, a good passer, that he is a good passer now. I think those are so many things that you have to focus on. And when we are talking about that playing out of structure, obviously Lamar can do that too. So how much can Monken take that, but mix in a little bit of like, all right, Caleb, we have to have moments where we settle down too.
Yeah. And it's so hard, because one of my favorite TV shows is Friday Night Lights, and Coach Taylor's teaching Vince Howard in season 4, which 4 and 5 are the best seasons. Fight me. Teaching this really athletic guy who's got incredible gift with his legs, timing routes, and he's getting criticism for it. And he's like, I know what I'm doing, but and they're like, no, you don't. You've never been Vince Howard. You've never been the guy who can do everything with his legs. And then teaching him to not use his legs and just use his arm. And there is something to that kind of story where if you have everything, and it's one of the reasons why like Michael Vick never watched film. And when you watch like the Vick documentary, the 30 for 30, talks about he didn't watch any film and he could just pick up a football and go kick your ass.
Yeah.
Well, there's something too, when you're too good, you don't put in the work. And there's something where if you're so good at one element, trying to get it structured and corralled can completely derail it. So I'm not going to say Caleb Williams is soft or delicate or anything like that, but you have to approach it with a little bit, like a little on the delicate side, because you don't want to take away what makes Caleb Williams special. And by making him do a lot of these little nuanced things that most quarterbacks have to do to be successful, some guys just don't. And maybe Williams is that guy. So just don't approach it with kid gloves, but approach it with kid gloves because you don't want to take away what's special about him. And that's why this hire is so important. I didn't think Caleb Williams was generational coming into this draft. Some people did. Some people were saying this guy could be the next Patrick Mahomes because, of course, he can do all the wild stuff. Yeah. Some of the throws he can make, like off platform, are insane. Like you couldn't even make it up with the video game insane. But it's the other stuff, the basics that Kurt Warner talks about. If you can play in structure, you can win in the NFL. The best quarterbacks, you name them. Like Pat Mahomes, once he learned how to really play in structure, now it doesn't matter. He can just
do whatever he wants.
He can screw around for 3 quarters, be down by 9, and come back and win the game with ease. Josh Allen now can play within structure. Look how good he is. The thing with alien quarterbacks, and I'll leave it at this. You love the fact that they can be aliens, but you want to take away how often they have to be aliens and make it easier for them. What that formula is for Caleb, I do not have the answer, but whoever is the guy that takes this job needs to have that answer and needs to put it into play and make it happen. And if you do, Caleb Williams could be one of the greats. If you fail at it, he could bust out. And that is why this hire is so incredibly important. Arguably one of the biggest hires in the National Football League over the course of the last decade.
Yeah, I agree completely. And that just reminded me of one more too, Joe Brady. That's another name that they're going to interview. And I love what Joe Brady's done with Josh Allen, because I think that you lose Stephon Diggs and you lose Gabe Davis, and everybody thought it was going to be this huge drop off because you're playing with Khalil Shakir, who, by the way, I like Khalil Shakir a lot, but and then Keon Coleman, a rookie, and Josh Allen had fumble problems and turnover problems, and you've seen all of that like diminish, and you've seen him be the best version of himself too. So Joe Brady's another name that has been sticking out to me. Also, I just don't know. I don't think he's like at the top of my list.
So Brady's an interesting one because obviously he broke in because of the success of Joe Burrow.
Yeah.
And of course, that Joe Burrow season is arguably the greatest season college football has ever seen from a quarterback. But I think what's really impressive about Brady is all the things I just talked about with Caleb, keeping him special while getting him to settle down and do some of the basic things. Look at Josh Allen.
Yeah.
Look at the little basic things that they've been able to do. He's playing better within structure. He's playing so much smarter. He threw 4 interceptions this year.
Yeah.
Like the way Allen has turned it, because 2 years ago, I think he threw like 21.
Yeah. And fumbled another like 14 or something like that. Like
it's the efficiency, the smarts. They've been able to take that to the next level with him. And maybe Brady is the guy for those reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, there's a lot of names out there. Which way the Bears go, we will see. I know people will love this episode because a lot of people are not on the Brian Flores train, but at least they get a little bit more into him. And then also all your perspective on these other guys is good too, especially Ben Johnson, because that is the name that I think most people are just hovering over. And I've been trying to like sway people over to Monken like the past month. I'm like, I really think Ben Johnson and Jacksonville have the best fit. So let's like start looking at somebody else you want. And that's why I've been trying to push people towards Monken and Cohen. So thanks for having my back on that side, Tyler. But yeah, I appreciate it. Every time we have a chat, it's always good. I know probably closer to draft, I'll have you back on and we'll break down some of these potential draft picks.
Looking forward to it, Taylor. I always like talking with smart people.
I love it. Thank you, Tyler. Have a good one.
You too.
All right, so thank you to Tyler Forness. Again, this is the beginning of my series that we are going to be covering several of the potential coaching hirings for the Bears. We've listed that was for Brian Flores. I'm looking for ones. I'm going to be doing Joe Brady. I'm going to do Pete Carroll. I'm going to do Mike McCarthy. I'm going to do obviously Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn. I'm going to do a Todd Bunkin. I'm going to do a Joe Brady. Those ones for sure, because those ones to me seem the most likely. If anybody else starts swinging in feeling like they are leading Cliff Kingsbury, I do not want, he said he's not even doing interviews until after the Washington Commanders are out. So we'll see what that looks like once he is. If that name gets back into the mix, we will see. But again, thanks everybody. It's been a long season. I know we just want to get this one right for once. So thanks for sticking with us. Thanks for being patient. And just breathe a little bit and just think about Caleb Williams and what's best for Caleb, because that is what is best for us. Anyways, chat with you guys soon. Hope you have a good weekend and enjoy playoff weekend. Enjoy the national championship on Monday. Go Irish and bear down.